So, dear Arbury Road followers, today we have again a very special guest. We are very happy to have him. It's Niels Fuglsang from the Danish Social Democrats. Before I'll say welcome to him, and I'll do that in Danish shortly, but the rest of the podcast will be in English, so still stay here if you don't are a Danish speaker. I remember you that this project lives also from your help, so please follow us. Even a coffee you pay to us is a great help for us. So nu siger jeg velbekomme, Niels. Jeg er meget glad, at du har fundet til for Arbury Road. Og hvordan var din dag i dag?
Den var god. Tak skal du have. Og den var god. Den er travl. En travl dag. Der er mange møder, men jeg har glædet mig til at være med her i jeres podcast.
Og det kan jeg mig forestille, at du har mange møller, og derfor siger jeg tak for din tid. So now we'll start right away with the discussion. First of all, we'll give to Niels the possibility to present himself a little bit further. In particular, for us, Niels has the great advantage. It's interesting for us because he is doing a podcast. So maybe you can say something about this podcast. And of course, this will be one of the main issues of this podcast. And secondly, you are also a member of the delegation EU-China, which is, I think, one of the most interesting relation in the geopolitical situation at the moment. So please, Niels, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be on the podcast. And may I compliment your Danish. I don't know where you learned that, but it sounded pretty good.
Min morfar har vel dansk.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. Anyway, I did this podcast called What's Left, and it's a podcast about the Social Democrats in Europe and about what I would call the crisis of the Social Democrats in Europe. Now, I made the podcast in the spring of 2020. And since then, things have gone a little bit better, and especially in Germany, where the Chancellor Olaf Scholz has taken the victory. Also in Norway, that's outside the European Union, but in Europe, where the Social Democrats have won elections. But still, I would say the overall situation for the Social Democrats is still that we stand considerably weaker than some decades ago. And I did this. I paid attention to my colleagues in the group room in the European Parliament, in the sense that they are fewer than they were last mandate, and in the last mandate they were fewer than they were in the good old days. And so I wondered what has gone wrong, or how do we explain this? And so I basically spoke to a number of colleagues from Germany, from Portugal, from France, from Sweden, Italy, and so I think I did 8 episodes or something like that. I spoke to Joseph Stiglitz and some other experts, trying to understand what was going on in different countries. You know, the Danish Social Democrats have not been doing that bad. We are in government right now. We've been so since 2019. And the Portuguese Social Democrats or Socialists, depending on which country you are, they're doing very well. I think they are above 30%, 35%, 36%, something like that, in the last elections, and they are in government. And those in the spring, those I think were the Social Democrats who did best. The German SPD was certainly not doing well in the spring. I mean, there were some polls where they were behind. They were 15% or something like that. And I think the Greens, they were in some polls in the spring, the largest party in German politics. So I thought, what is the common denominator? Is there anything, you know, when you look at Portugal and Denmark, what is the similarity? Is there something that they have in common? I think what they did, to some extent, they're very different countries, so there are many specific conditions that don't apply to both of them. But I think one thing that they did have somewhat in common is that they both they both took an issue with what we could call politics of necessity. They both went up against what you could call politics of necessity. And when I talk about politics of necessity, I mean a policy that you've had in Denmark, that you've had in many other countries. I would argue that you also had in Germany, where you say, okay, we have globalization and we need to compete with other countries. And how do we do that? Well, we better cut taxes for the wealthy, for top income groups, better cut corporate tax rates, and then we better cut social insurance, social benefits, so that people are not too lazy, so that people will actually work instead of going on social benefits. And so you basically decrease the redistribution of the welfare state, increasing inequality in society. And you said this is necessary. This is why I would go. In Denmark we have an expression called policy of necessity, or politics of necessity. This is necessary. We don't necessarily want to do it, but we have to do it, because otherwise the Chinese will outcompete us, or Germany will outcompete us, or other countries will outcompete us. All our neighbors will outcompete us. So we have to, and that is going to be a race to the bottom if everybody cuts corporate tax rates, for example. And basically, it's an advantage to those who earn the most. It's an advantage to big companies and those who hold big fortunes. It's not necessarily an advantage to those who are dependent on the welfare state. And those are a lot of our voters, I would say. So maybe some of these voters have said, well, we don't think that's really what we were promised, and we don't appreciate it. And the globalization that was supposed to be so cool, maybe it's not that cool anyway. And I think, so my point is, I think Denmark and Portugal in particular, changed that policy and went up against the policy of necessity, and said we don't want to. They were one of the countries that went basically bankrupt after the financial crisis, and the EU pushed them or put pressure on them to make austerity policies, which they did for some time, but then they went up against them and said, no, we're going to actually increase wages and increase public consumption to invest in the society. And so they increased employment, and they actually went from a downturn in the economy to a boom in the economy. And it has worked pretty well for them. In Denmark, we have we have not been exposed to hardcore austerity policies like Portugal. But we have, during the last 20, 30 years, both Social Democrats and liberal conservative governments have actually decreased redistribution and increased inequality. And I think the current government is trying to correct that. So we have introduced pensions to some of the people who have been the longest on the labor market. They can now retire earlier than before. They have the right to do that. And that's the first time we have done something like that in decades, to decrease the labor supply, basically, to say, it's okay that you step out of that you take your retirement because you deserved it. And of course, you have to find the money to do this, but this is, we have a pretty solid public budget. We could afford this. So basically, I think that's what they have in common, and that's the roots of the social democratic crisis, that we have globalization combined with a policy of necessity where you cut down on redistribution. And I think voters have punished us for that.
I like very much the concept that you expressed from the Danish politics of necessity. And actually, I remember when I started to become politically active, I was in a sense envying the 80s, because then there was a more positive approach from the left doing politics than 5 years ago. Actually, that's a little bit what you were describing in Germany or in Italy, or often the campaigns where you have to vote as big, and we have to do great coalitions and to introduce liberal market reforms as the Schröder market did, because it's a necessity. And it was not about a positive view, how social democracy can shape the future. And maybe this is how the discourse now is changing, because now also in Spain, the Social Democrats are in government, also in Germany. Maybe because with this new industrial revolution, we have again the chance to shape something positively. I'll have a question before going further in details about the podcast, about this issue you have spoken about, that globalization has put under pressure the social system in a way, and created a wave of liberalization in the past years. Here, the question is a little bit, well, the promise of the European Union for me, or the social European Union, is a convergence going up instead of a convergence downward. And an element of this convergent upward could be an European minimum wage in a form or another. Now I know that this is seen quite critically in Denmark, also related to the fagbevægelse, the trade unions. And maybe you can explain the perspective and the skepticality, the problems about such a project.
Yes, I think you are right that a minimum wage could be seen as a race upwards instead of or convergence upwards instead of a race to the bottom. I think our problem with the minimum wage in Denmark, and we stand here with the Swedes, it's the Danish and the Swedish who are mainly opposing this idea, is our problem is that we have a model, we don't have a minimum wage, we don't have a law on a minimum wage in Denmark. We have a labor union negotiations. So the labor unions and the employers unions, they negotiate each year on the wages. And we've done so since 1899. And actually you can, it's legal to pay a wage below that negotiation result. But if you do that, then the labor unions have the right to make a conflict against you. They can strike, they can also block you from getting, goods from other companies and so on. So they can make your life pretty difficult. And that's why most employers, they actually stick to the wages that are negotiated, and then they are members of an employer organization. So it's an organized labor market where we negotiate the wages. And our experience is that that system has worked rather well. We are happy with that system. We think that we have negotiated compared to countries where you have legal minimum wage, we have negotiated higher wages. I think myself, I agree with this analysis. I think if we have a pretty equal society in Denmark, it's getting less equal because of the things we talked about just a minute ago. But it's still pretty equal compared to many countries, in the sense that the people who own the companies and who make profit, a certain share of that profit is distributed into wages. So the workers, they get a good share of the profit, basically, compared to most places. And I think that is a result of the negotiations. I think if I should point one thing that really has mattered for the Danish welfare society, it is the we call it the Danish model, which is the negotiations around the wages. And not only wages, also working conditions. For example, right to have a vacation, right to have maternity or paternity leave, right to have a job that doesn't wear you down. And so we have fought for these rights throughout the last century, where we have negotiated, or labor unions have negotiated more and more rights. And if we have a minimum wage, legal minimum wage, we are quite certain that it will be lower than our negotiation results. And so it will, for Denmark, it will risk lowering our wages. And we, of course, don't want that. So we're saying, every country is it can have a minimum wage, and that is, of course, their decision. And in some countries, it might even be a very good idea because the labor unions are not strong, so they cannot negotiate. And I know that Olaf Scholz, for example, he wants a higher minimum wage, and that might be a good idea in Germany. But we would like to keep our system. So we don't want an EU-wide minimum wage. We want the countries to want a minimum wage. They should just do that. But then we don't want a EU system that sort of just threatens our system. That's our position.
Yeah, thanks for explaining. Actually, again, time is hunting us. Otherwise, I think it's a broad issue where we could discuss for hours. But let's go a little bit again back to the podcast, because Arbery Road is a similar concept. We also saw it was developed by PhD students in Cambridge when the Brexit happened. Actually, again, they felt that the Social Democrats were not doing a positive campaign in England to avoid the Brexit, and they wanted to develop a more positive, more aggressive in a sense social policy from the social democracy and from the progressive spectrum. We don't see us especially close to Social Democrats, also Greens or the left. And we're also searching to develop new concepts of what does it mean to be left. And you have already spoken a little bit about it, but when doing a European podcast, we faced the problem of language, as we have seen also in this podcast. So you found a solution. I hear that your podcast, you do an introduction in Danish, and also in between, maybe you explain the general situation in Danish. And then the interview is in English. Maybe how did you have the idea, and how does it feel as a format? Are you satisfied with it?
Well, thank you for those questions. I mean, well, my assistant, in the European Parliament, we are fortunate enough to have some resources so we can hire people. So I have a couple of people who help me here with my parliamentary work, and one of these guys got the idea, and it was actually just looking at around in Europe and speaking with my colleagues and speaking with my assistant. He spoke with people in the parliament, and we realized that it's actually not going so well for the Social Democrats. It could go better. So we're politically interested people, trying to also read international newspapers and follow the debate. And so we thought that's a pretty interesting question. And I thought for the Danish audience, it would be interesting. At that time, now our government is a little bit more under pressure because of some different political questions. But at that time, in particular, the government was really doing very good. And we thought, but that's not the case in the rest of Europe. Social Democrats are not doing so good. And so we thought it would be interesting to investigate that, basically. And I think being a member of the European Parliament, you have a pretty good position for investigating it, since I could just go and speak with my colleagues from all these countries. You learn a lot from different countries in Europe. And yes, then I did it in Danish, the introduction. But am I satisfied with that? Yes, I am satisfied with the result. I'm proud of the podcast. It's mainly the audience is mainly Danish Social Democrats. So I'm wondering if I should continue the podcast, but then actually just change it to English, the whole thing, because perhaps there would be, and perhaps your own podcast is a testimony of that. Perhaps there would be interest for a larger audience, because it is not a Danish question necessarily, it's a European question, and it's about the European Social Democrats.
What we actually decided to do is also to use English as the common language for articles and podcasts, but also do podcasts in between in other languages. For example, today I did also one in German, we had some in Italian. So I have to admit we hadn't until now not one in Danish, but we are working on that.
Well, with your language, you can easily make one in Danish.
Guten Tag, guten Tag. Yeah, let's see. I'll work on that. Let's touch a last issue that is very important. As I said, time is hunting us today. The EU-China relation. You are in the delegation of the European Parliament for the EU and China relation. First of all, maybe I would like to ask, because I'm working at the European Parliament, so maybe we'll meet the next day, although now with the reduced presence work, it's difficult. But the question is, how does it work with the delegation? Who chooses who is member in the delegation? And what is the duty of this delegation, so that our hearers can get an idea of what it is about?
Well, basically, when you start in the European Parliament, you make a wish list for the committees and the delegations you want to sit in. And I chose China, and it's not self-evident. You cannot get everything you want, because there are more people who want to sit in the China delegation than there are spaces or there are seats in the China delegation. But I was lucky enough to get in there. It's a negotiation with the other delegations and so on. And I'm happy to get to be there, because I think China is really a fundamental question for us. How is our relationship with China going to be? With China rising in power and influence in economy, and at the same time obviously not having the same values as we do, or having different values when it comes to human rights, democracy, and so on. So I think it's an important question for the European Union. So I'm very happy to, I think it's meaningful to deal with that.
Indeed, for me, I spent 3 months working in Shanghai some years before Corona, luckily. It was indeed a life-shaping experience, seeing how really different. And you discover also how similar we Europeans are in that sense, thinking of China. So maybe you can give us an overview of how you see the relations in a geopolitical context between the EU and China, and what can be the future developments of this relation.
Yes, I think that the relationship has changed quite a lot from being a sort of an economic trade relation, where we have accepted a lot of different stuff from China, because we didn't see them as a threat or as a rival. Right now we have our strategy. I believe we call them a systemic rival. Also someone we want to cooperate with, but also a rival to some extent. You know, because I think we realized that having investments from China in, for example, critical infrastructure is not only about trade and business, it's also about political influence. And they don't have the same interests as we do always. So, you know, having the largest, having the harbor of Athens, it's called Piraeus, owned by the Chinese, might not be a very good idea, because they can use that economic power to put pressure on Greece if they have an opinion about the human rights violations in Hong Kong or elsewhere around China. So I think we've become less naive. I think it's about high time we become less naive. You know, the famous economist Milton Friedman, he said, he's been quoted for saying, "The business of business is business." So when businesses or companies trade, it's about making money, it's about business. But that's not the case with China always. It's the business of business is also politics. And I think we need to be aware of that. And I think there is sort of a changing atmosphere or changing opinion. It changed radically from just a couple of years ago, as far as I can see. And China has also behaved, it's become very exposed how China behaves in relation to Xinjiang or Hong Kong or Taiwan. And so we also need to understand that this is about values and it's about politics.
I think for Social Democrats, having to reply to Milton Friedman is one of the favorite hobbies, actually, the most famous neoliberal theoretical person. Then maybe let's have a look it's a good actually bridge to my last question about China, about this from neoliberal policy to really more socialistic policies. We've seen that China in the last 30 years, since the opening of China, has basically really adopted a capitalistic system when it comes to economy, not when it comes to politics. But there are some signals that may think that some things are changing. For example, now the government kind of forced big tech company to do donations for educational projects, and there was a meeting of the in August of the Commission for Finance and Economy, and the spokesperson for the Chinese government said that it was about wealth for everyone, that it meant really for everyone and not for some few persons. Are we seeing that China is discovering that that capitalism is maybe not in its purest form the solution to Chinese problem, that they have now to build really a strong state guaranteeing for social wealth to everyone, in this sense being a more systemic threat, because if they really can build up welfare for everybody, then it's even more difficult for us as social democrats to argument why our liberal democracy are working best.
Yes, well, I think that China has certainly, I mean, we thought that China would go in the direction of opening up democracy. It had become capitalist to some degree, and normally actually in the theories of the political theories on democracy and capitalism, you would say that when you have capitalism, you will have a middle class, and that middle class will start demanding democracy. So capitalism leads to democracy, and I think many thought that that was what was going to happen in China, and I think there was signs that was happening to some degree. But later years with Xi Jinping has shown that was not the case. China has gone in the opposite direction when it comes to democracy, but also when it, looking at capitalism in China, I think we've seen that the state is still very much in control about what's going to happen. You have this guy Jack Ma from Alibaba, who one of the biggest businessmen and richest people in China, who came out with a criticism on how the government regulated, and then he disappeared for 4 months or something like that. He was also called Crazy Jack. I don't know. I think he has some different ideas, but anyway, that was besides the point. He disappeared, and now there's not so much criticism from his side. So I think the state is still showing that it is the state that decides how capitalism works. It's not the other way around, and the state doesn't open up too much when it comes to democracy either. So I think unfortunately they have not gone in the direction of our values. But we need to cooperate with them, especially when it comes to climate change and the massive challenges that we face. So I think it's right to both look at them as a rival and as someone we need to cooperate with.
Yeah, that's a good introduction of the ending, I think, for this podcast, as you have a full schedule. Niels, tusind tak for din tid igen.
Tak skal du have.
It was a good and enlightening discussion. So, dear Arbory hearer, this was Niels. We hope to have him as guest also in the future. And we hope you enjoyed the podcast. And don't forget, now you discovered another interesting podcast called What's Left, done by Niels Fuglsang, where actually the last podcast were even with German MEPs like Delara Burkhardt. So that was it.